Hello everyone and welcome to the second virtual walking tour of Mexico City presented by the City.mx. I'm Andrea Ortegali and today we're going to take a really quick walk down one of the oldest and most iconic streets in downtown Mexico City, Calle de Tacuba. This is just one short section of the much longer Calzada Mexico-Tacuba. That's one of the original causeways that ran all the way out to Tenochtitlan. Dated at least from the early 15th century, it's the oldest avenue not only in Mexico but probably in the entire continent. This causeway exists because people needed a quick way to get from Tacuba to Tenochtitlan and vice versa. They're both important parts, as we'll see, of a triple alliance that kept both city-states safe from the arguably more powerful people of Azcapotzalco that is located to the northwest. This is just one of the three causeways crossing the ancient lake and connecting Tenochtitlan, the island city, to the mainland. We'll cover a bit more of the Mexico-Tacuba causeway in the future. Today we're just looking at this short section of the street on the island that is today the center of the city. But let's make a quick side note too. On the site, the City.mx, we do tend to translate the word calzada to causeway, just in the given names of these three original causeways. First of all, so that readers get an idea of these roads crossing water on both sides. And secondly, because people with just a little Spanish sometimes think that the word calzada has something to do with socks or underwear. In fact, in English and Spanish, they come from the same Latin root, that is calx. Calx refers to the limestones. In English, it's cau, CAU, meaning these are specifically raised and paved roads, and the two words are still cognates. So you only need to imagine crossing this 6-kilometer long causeway. It was built connecting numerous little islands on the lake, and no fewer than 7 bridges connected these sections that were built over landfill. You can get an idea of the hydrological engineering involved because the water on one side needed to flow freely with the same water on the other. But ultimately, we're going to arrive to Tenochtitlan here, right behind the famous Palacio de Bellas Artes. Now, on the former island city of Tenochtitlan, the street name simply changes to Calle de Tacuba, Tacuba Street. It goes straight to the Zócalo, and it's home to one of the most famous and traditional restaurants in the city, the Café Tacuba. One of the first things we see on the right, crossing Eje Central, is one of Mexico City's most stunning buildings. The Palacio de Correos is the Postal Palace in English. It was designed by the Italian architect Adamo Boari and then constructed by Mexican engineer Gonzalo Garita in the early 20th century, and it remains an absolute emblem of Porfirio Díaz's regime. The building itself is a historical monument. The stunning neo-Gothic Venetian facade, with some Moorish hints on the arches, contrasts with the neoclassical interiors. It carries with it just the notion of the magnificent monument still standing today, of some known existent kingdom where the Mexican eclectic architecture seems to come from. Inspired by the styles then in vogue in Europe, eclecticism is just the cherry-picking and mixing of visual elements from multiple other, more serious architecture styles, so no inspiration could be forgotten. It's a bit like an early take on postmodernism. The most abundant elements here are in the Plateresque style. These are easily recognizable in the tensible remarks all over the facade. Among them are Moorish arches, heraldic shields, bronze gargoyles, masterly crafted ironwork, and a characteristic yellowish tone on the walls obtained from the oxidation of the white stone brought from Pachuca, some 90 kilometers north to the city. The Postal Palace served as a post office, and it still does, but it never served the Mexican nation as Porfirio Díaz imagined it would. At a time where the world was rushing into industrialization, exactly where Díaz desperately wanted to compete, he forgot to build something more solid than his majestic facades. The Díaz regime fell to the Mexican Revolution in 1910, just 3 years after the palace opened. Today, it's still the main post office, and for that reason, it is free and it is easy to visit. There is Postal Museum inside. But honestly, most people just visit to see the staircases and the banisters. Tuesdays through Sundays, it's wide open. Our second stop is the National Museum of Art, called MUNAL. This was known as Palace of Communications and was built similar to the Palacio Postal to show off the office of the Secretary of Communications and Public Works. It stands on the site where the Hospital de San Andrés used to be. That hospital was famous for having been the site where the second Mexican Emperor Maximiliano was embalmed and exhibited after he was executed in 1867. The demolition of the hospital left just the Casona de Xicoténcatl, which was the Senate House and today is a cultural center. That's at the corner of the alleyway called Xicoténcatl 2. The project for a communications building was assigned to the Italian architect Silvio Contri, and it was all part of Porfirio Díaz's master plan for Mexico City, intended to project a more modern and stronger image of the country. The style here is eclectic too, with prominent elements of neoclassical and neo-Renaissance styles. Decorative elements and details were created by Juan Marino Copede and his family, who also did the paintings on the ceiling for the spectacular main staircase. The building only became the MUNAL, the National Museum of Art, 1982. The collection includes permanent exhibitions of Mexican artists from all 5 centuries of Mexico's colonial and modern history. It's an obligatory stop for those interested in the most iconic and representative artists of Mexico. The MUNAL building faces the Plaza Manuel Tolsa. It's named for the architect and artist who created the gigantic equestrian statue of King Charles IV of Spain, as well as the gigantic building across the street, but we'll come to that in a moment. This equestrian statue is ironically known as El Caballito, the little horse, or perhaps the little pony. Magnificent by any means, its subject actually faces something of the same fate as the artist. Manuel Tolsa has here cast the second biggest statue in bronze of all the bronze statues in the world. But talk about bad timing. His sculpture was cast at the cusp of the independent movement. But even worse, Charles IV ended up abdicating the throne already in 1808, just 5 years after Tolsa managed to pour his 27.5 tons of liquid bronze into the sand. The statue had been ordered by the Viceroy Miguel de la Grua, Talamanca. Today, he is considered one of the most infamous and corrupt of all of New Spain's corrupt and infamous viceroys. He hired Tolsa to create the statue to try to regain some kind of favor from Charles IV, but Talamanca was removed from his post here and sent back to Spain, just in time for the abdication and Spain's slip into the Peninsular War with Napoleon. So, from what exactly was Mexico seeking independence? The statue, polished up and still warm in 1803, was put in the very middle of the Zócalo, Mexico City's main big plaza, at the end of the street. Its pedestal had, after all, been waiting there in the Zócalo since 1796. But the statue was so big that the visiting German naturalist Alexander von Humboldt described the moving of the statue as a work of engineering in itself. Moving it 1,600 meters on a bronze wheel cart took 5 days. But the point is, Manuel Tolsa may have already been the fate that history had in store for him. He died in 1816, never knowing how the independence movement would turn out. By 1829, with the triumph of the movement, anti-Spanish sentiment had kicked into high gear, so much that no one wanted the forgotten King Carlos IV and his huge horse. It was only saved by Lucas Alamán, funny enough, something of an arch-conservative, who convinced the first Mexican president, Guadalupe Victoria, to preserve it for its artistic value. After a 19th century being laboriously moved from place to place, the statue bears a message clarifying that it was preserved for its artistic value, not as any kind of symbol of allegiance to any foreign monarch. Now, on the opposite side of the same Plaza de Manuel Tolsa, you'll see an even more extravagant artistic masterpiece, the Palacio de Minería, the Palace of Mining. It was designed and built by Tolsa, finishing only in 1813. He'd worked on it for nearly 15 years, including almost the entire time he'd been working on the statue. The palace is even today one of the most important neoclassical works anywhere in the Americas. Now here you want to consider that neoclassicism is coming in fashion precisely in line with the age's scientific developments and the European Enlightenment. Classically shaped buildings, inspired by a Greek and Roman rationale, where proportion and symmetry are everything, are important to governments and authorities all over the Western world. The message is one of rationality, order, and power represented in this never outdated classic style. Inside, you'll find a magnificent patio, a chapel to the Virgen de Guadalupe, perhaps the most stunning staircase yet. These are just some of the building's most inspiring details. The Palacio de Minería was one of the first buildings to be designed exclusively for engineering and metallurgical studies. And here, it's easy to forget the tremendous importance these industries had during the Spanish Empire. Nearly all the wealth came from mining. But like seemingly everything on this street, the palace served its original purpose for just a brief time. Closed after the War for Independence, it was briefly considered for the imperial mansion of Maximiliano de Habsburgo in the 1860s, but he ultimately preferred the Chapultepec castle. In 1867, it was finally returned to the engineering school, Maximilian, after all, having been embalmed right next door. The Palacio then served as the engineering school until the National University moved to Ciudad Universitaria in the 1950s. They still own and use the building, and today it's best remembered for its annual International Book Fair. Oh, and Manuel Tosa is in fact honored with a small museum inside. Facing the Palacio on its western corner is a little-known park that draws us a bit deeper in the city's story, the Jardín de la Triple Alianza, or if you prefer, the Garden of the Triple Alliance. It's at the corner of Tacuba and Filomeno Mata streets. The garden contains 3 bronze plaques in deep bas-relief, which represent the pre-Hispanic rulers who were parties to the mighty Triple Alliance that put an end to subjugation by the kingdom of Azcapotzalco, ultimately opening the era for the true splendor of the Mexica Empire centered in Tenochtitlan. The rulers depicted are Nezahualcóyotl, the king of Texcoco to the east, Izcoatl, the king of the Mexica in Tenochtitlan, and Totoquihuatzin, the king of Tacuba, 6 kilometers away across that same causeway. The artist followed a neoclassical style, adapting these local characters. We can notice the classical styling in the body positions, in their heights, the shapes of their faces and the muscles, resembling far more those Roman emperors than indigenous lords. This was an attempt to align these then only recently remembered heroes of the Mexican past. And in fact, they went on to represent the Porfirio Diaz regime at the Universal Exhibition in Paris in 1889. There's a 4th figure of the last Mexica emperor, Cuauhtémoc, inside the Army and Air Force Museum that takes up the garden's 2 walls. Finally, moving just a bit further down the street, we come to the MIDE. It's the Interactive Museum of Economy, once the monastery and hospital of the Bethlehemitas Order. Their church was that Army and Navy museum that we've just seen. Designed by architect Lorenzo Rodriguez in the 18th century, it's a colonial building, and its many finishings we can clearly recognize the fingerprints of Mexico City's unique colonial period. The red and brown color scheme is typical of the abundant Tezontle stone, which is mined from the region's many volcanoes. The Bethlehemite order ran this hospital and the church, now hosting the Army and Air Force Museum, until the War for Independence, when the Spanish royalists disbanded the order for siding with the insurgents. By 1828, the same president who served the Charles IV statue turned the monastery into a military academy. Some 30 years, the anti-clerical religious reform laws meant the Bethlehemites would never get the property back, and most of it was carved up to build the Grand National Theatre to the south. This and many other church properties thus changed hands. They were put first to governmental use and then later into private hands. Now, lots of international visitors won't want to bother with a museum of economics, but that's a shame. This one has won award after award for its visitor experience and for the overall quality of its exhibitions. It's also one of the most important rehabilitation projects that the Institute of Anthropology and History Institute participated in. A building rehab that took some 15 years. Crossing Bolivar Street is today's last stop. The Library of the Congress of the Union is one of the biggest archives in the Mexico City Center. One of the most well-preserved church properties, the original building was another convent, and this was their church. The church and convent construction began right at the turn of the 17th century, in 1601. The whole project took 60 years. The religious complex is classified as early Baroque because even though its last modifications were made during the height of the Baroque period, unfortunately a fire destroyed most of the original building. It's still the original fortress like the Sontle-covered walls that colored the Mexico City streets in the 1600s. When it ceased its role as a religious convent, it served as public offices, military barracks, and the famous cantina even well into the 20th century. But in 1936, the idea to unite all the acquisitions and legislative minutes for both congressional chambers came to be. And so today, it's the Congressional Library and Archive. Inside, though, it still feels like a temple until your eyes adjust and you can see it's pretty substantial library. Until you get here yourself, there's a lot to look at and to click on the app and on the website at thecity.mx. And if you'd like to know more, just drop us a line.